Hello. This is one of a series of webinars designed to provoke discussion of recent IJNA articles. And if you've missed the last three, you can find links to them on YouTube on the Nautical Archaeology Society website. When we started doing these online seminars last year, we didn't realize quite what a leap into the future we were taking, nor how quickly meeting and talking this way would become part of our everyday existence in lockdown. So I hope you're all coping, and thank you for finding time to attend and spend another hour looking at a screen. Not going out and mingling with like-minded people is no doubt particularly challenging for the subject we're going to discuss today, that of public nautical archaeology and community-driven research. Although that said, the NAS has been busily finding new ways to engage the public online over the past few weeks, and they're doing a great job, so do go and check that out. I've asked Nautical Archaeology Society Education Officer Peter Knott to join me as co-host today, as our subject is obviously key to the Nautical Archaeology Society remit, and Peter will be joining in discussion after the panel presentations. So Peter, I don't know if are you there? Can you say hello?
Hi, Miranda. It's lovely to be here with you today.
Great, good to see you. If you haven't read our panelists' articles yet, you can find them free to download on the IJNA webpage or on the NAS website on the part to do with the seminars. So let me introduce the panel. First up, we have Guzdan Varinlioglu. Guzdan is Associate Professor in the Department of Architecture at Izmir, Turkey, and former President of SAD Underwater Research Society. Her recent IJNA article is titled Assessing a Decade of Cache Underwater Archaeopark. Guzdan, are you there? Hi, nice to see you.
Hi, nice to see you.
We also have Stephen Wickler, who's a researcher at the Arctic University Museum of Norway in Tromsø. Stephen's published several articles with the IJNA, and the latest is titled Iconic Arctic Shipwrecks, Archaeology and Museum Narratives. Hi, Stephen.
Hi.
And finally, we have Andy Paducah. Andy is Assistant Director of Maritime and Commonwealth Heritage for the Australian Government in Canberra, and wins the prize for the longest title and also the longest title of his article, going for the win-win, including the public in underwater cultural heritage management through citizen science in Australia and New Zealand. Andy, are you there? He is.
Hello.
Hi, Andy. The title of this webinar is Whose Watery Past Is It? What can we learn from recent public nautical archaeology projects, and what does the discipline gain from community-driven research? Archaeology has travelled a long and rocky road with public archaeology, and in many countries the question of who owns the past is still hotly disputed. These issues are only complicated when the physical remains of that past are underwater, accessible to only a few, and shrouded to this day in a finders keepers treasure for sale narrative in much of the world's press. However, at a minimalist level, we can probably agree that to obtain the political and financial backing required to continue research, wide-based public knowledge and support is a necessity. Faced with the scale of the task of recording and managing the world's maritime record, building capacity within the general public has seemed an attractive, if not always an easy option. I think perhaps more fundamentally, the interests and questions raised by a more diverse group may enrich the academic debate by forcing us to look at the data from a wider range of perspectives. And I think in the presentations we're going to hear, we'll undoubtedly illustrate some of these issues. So we're going to start with Guzdan, who's going to talk about the Cache Underwater Archaeopark in Turkey. So over to you, Guzdan.
Okay, perfect. Okay, hello everyone. Hello Miranda. I want to thank Miranda first for her very kind support during the process of this publication. And thanks, Mark, again, for his very kind support for years for us, for Underwater Research Society, to be part of NAS system. I want to introduce the society that I represent, Underwater Research Society. So we are a non-governmental organization since 2019. And SAD has sorry, not 19, of course, it's from 1994. So SAD has played quite active roles in including the locals, the nationals, and some international projects. And we had a reward, like one of the reward is Henry Ford European Conservation Award in the previous years. So as SAD, not SAD, so we have various research fields like monk research, monk seals, coastal management plans, cave diving projects. But what I will be presenting will be more about the nautical archaeology branch of ours. So we will be focusing on the research, public awareness, and preservation projects on the culture heritage, on underwater culture heritage of Turkey. Usually, as I said, supported by local people and supervised by academicians, and sometimes, if we are lucky, sponsored by international institutions. SAD has been working on several projects. And I will be presenting by very recent, like the two important projects that we happen to be doing in the recent years. And a very quick introduction is that I am still a volunteer of Underwater Research Society, and I was the president in the previous season. But I am an architect now working on computational design exactly. So I have a position and I switched my field to my original field. But still, I would like to show you some of the projects that we have been working on. So the first one is underwater surveys that we've been doing for a need to document, research, and preserve underwater sites. And our projects has emerged from the intention of bridging the gap between trained specialists, like archaeologists, and divers by identifying the underwater culture heritage for future preservation and dissemination of the heritage. And virtual museum that we finished finally, like setting up together with UCLA, was part of my postdoctoral research actually, was an online inventory for systematic data collection, description, and analysis on the sites, wrecks, findings, and we've been working with divers, and we've been collecting sketches, measurements, drawings, photographs, in addition to the real input of the divers, their observations and descriptions. And later on, this inventory is turned into a virtual museum by some more visualization tools like photogrammetric visualization, some GIS-based data, and even, the latest stage was the parametric modeling, the procedural modeling of the artifact using this numeric data. Overall, the virtual museum has been using a particular emphasis on collecting the information digitally without disturbing the archaeological remains of that area. Returning back to the paper very quickly, assessing a decade of Kaş Underwater Archaeopark, almost like now 14 years, a bit more than 10 years actually, is about the same region as you see in this map, about the south coast of Turkey, Antalya, Kaş, and specifically where it's placed, Hidayet Bay, not far from the downtown Kaş, from the town of Kaş. So this paper especially is presenting this underwater museum, and that includes a reconstruction and an archaeological site. So a reconstruction of a ship and the reconstruction of an archaeological site. And we are emphasizing three outcomes mainly. We are during this paper, it's about education through nautical archaeology training. Second, recreational diving as a means to raise public awareness, and research through experimental archaeology projects. So very quick introduction to the paper. Actually, some of the visuals that I didn't use in the paper might just like have you to orient, what the project is about. We call it, it's an underwater museum. It's an underwater museum that initiated to get the attention of the local people, archaeologists, and anyone interested in historical and archaeological potential of this environment, Kaş region, where not far actually the original Uluburun shipwreck is found and excavated. But in our project, so we use an interpretative replica in our underwater museum, the reanimation of the Uluburun ship and its cargo site, and we place them side by side at a very, kind of recreational diving limits. And since then, we've been running the archaeological trainings and experimental archaeology projects in this region. I don't know whether I missed to say that the project has started in 2006. So since then, we've been using this site quite actively in the first 5 to 7 years. But now the archaeological site is still there, but the wood that we placed underwater, the ship, is mostly disintegrated. But of course, except from this academic part of this project, we were quite intensely running Nautical Archaeology Society training programs. Actually, first we started by putting our own Turkish case by SAT training program, but later on we managed to cooperate with Nautical Archaeology Society program. And since then, since 2007, actually we are running these trainings. Not that regularly, but still, we go and use this site. But another public awareness project was a very small, but European Union supported project, Young Archaeo Park project, where we started having more the local people, the local youth, actually, and we were introducing the heritage concepts, not only for underwater, but for above the water in this site. So these were, some of the good public awareness projects, some conferences, some trainings, some even we've been going to the diving centers and we've been educating the diving guides about the real heritage, the archaeological heritage of this area. So besides these, like the outcomes of these projects and comparing Archaeopark with other underwater museums in Turkey, I want to emphasize before I exceed my time is that like this is well published in different fields, especially as my background is academia as well. We've been publishing, in various conferences, but I want to, emphasize a few things that the main aim was to reduce the exclusion of the general public from archaeologically sensitive underwater sites. And we wanted to train non-specialist divers to be able to participate in underwater projects involving recording the culture heritage of Turkey. And of course, in this context, in the Turkish context, we are having a lot of archaeological surveys and excavations in the past decades. However, the shoreline of Turkey is so extensive, and some of the areas are beyond the reach of nautical archaeologists, and we don't have so many. So we need these divers, we need these recreational divers to be included in this process. And of course, another reason is that we have quite a numerous amount of divers in Turkey, and they access these sites, these archaeological sites, more often than the archaeologists. So overall, this project, this Kaş Archaeopark project and a decade of Archaeopark project has been using the benefit of being with the local support and of course the contribution of the well-trained divers, in a way bridging the gap between the academia and the local people. Thanks for listening.
Thank you, Gülsen. That was great, a great introduction to your project and beautiful pictures as usual from Kaş. So next we have Stephen Wickler, who's going to compare at least two, I think, ongoing projects that are connected in some way to northern Norway. Stephen, over to you.
Thank you, Miranda. I wanted to select just two of the three wrecks I talked about in my article, and particularly the ones that pertain to public participation in the actual projects. And those are both ships from Arctic Norway. One is just below the Arctic Circle, the other is further up. And I use these as case studies to look at the role of these ships as heritage icons. The first is Belgica, which was originally built in Norway as a whaling ship, and it was used later by the Belgian Adrian de Gerlache in his expedition to Antarctica, which was the first to overwinter. By accident, they froze into the ice, so they hadn't planned to do that, but they ended up doing that. And then the second ship is the Lovend boat, which was recently excavated, and that's a late medieval cargo vessel from a small offshore island. I'd like to raise three primary discussion topics that we can perhaps get into after our presentations. The first is the role of heritage iconization as a situated process and how this reflects owning and mobilizing the past as some type of public agenda. What's important to remember is defining the public is critical in terms of an iconic wreck. And the two ships I'm talking about reflect opposite scales of involvement. From the first, Belgica is more at a macro scale and it reflects national iconization efforts, whereas the second, the Lovend vessel, is more at a micro scale and very much reflects local community involvement. So it's interesting to contrast those two wrecks in that respect. The second issue is how we balance professional and community-led research and interpretive interests. That's a fundamental issue, I think, for all of us that deal with communities and public participation. And thirdly, I want to bring in the museological perspective to the issue of public involvement and how that's reflected in exhibition narratives. Now, both of these wrecks I'm talking about are planned for exhibitions. So there's exhibitions planned around both of the wrecks. So that's a relevant topic as well. Just a brief overview of the individual wrecks. Let's start with Belgica. And as I mentioned, it was built as a whaler, 1884, in Norway itself. And then it was purchased later on by de Gerlache and used in his Antarctic expedition, which went from 1897 to 99. Now, this vessel had a very interesting and multifaceted life history, but the final phase, it ended up as a hulk, basically, and it was used to store ammunition. And during a German World War II air raid in 1940, it was sunk. It wasn't directly hit by the Germans, but just the disturbance from the bombs sunk the wreck. So it went straight to the bottom. The wreck was rediscovered, if you will, in 1990 by recreational divers, and it was given to the nonprofit Belgica Society in 2007, whose intention was to raise the wreck and display it in Belgium. Belgica is automatically protected by our heritage legislation in Norway, which protects all shipwrecks and their cargo that are over 100 years of age. So this meant that we had to interact with the applicants, which were the Belgica Society, and that initiated a long-standing feasibility assessment for potentially raising the ship that involved international crew or group of maritime archaeologists, both Belgians, Danish, and Norwegian archaeologists. And this is still ongoing, and it's been incredibly fruitful as a research project because it's been able to give us an insight into the process of deterioration for the wreck itself and how we can implement conservation measures. So that's been a really a win-win situation with that wreck. The second wreck is the Lovend boat. This is the only existing medieval wreck to the north of southwestern Norway. So there are no other known medieval wrecks either in central Norway or northern Norway. So it's quite unique. It's one of a kind, if you will. And it was discovered by accident during sand mining in the intertidal zone on a very small offshore island, about 20 kilometers off the mainland. It's clinker built, and it was a dendrochronology gave us insights into the fact that it was made of oak, and it was built in southern Norway around 1460, and most likely involved in the quite widespread stockfish trade, that is dried cod trade between northern Norway and the port of Bergen in southwestern Norway. The wreck was excavated as a research excavation by the Arctic University Museum of Norway, where I work, and the Norwegian Maritime Museum over a 2-year period, 2016 and 17. The entire process through excavation, conservation, reconstruction, and exhibition was financed by a local community interest group. And the interesting thing about Lovind, half of the population worked for a salmon farming industry, and they were instrumental in supporting this research interest group. So it's quite interesting that salmon farming is really at the core of local interest. And I see the Lovind boat as an iconic symbol for attempts by the community to reimagine a golden age as they see it. And this would be during the medieval period, when this very small island was a central component in a far-reaching European maritime trade network involving the movement of stockfish. And I also see it being used as a medium for them to legitimize this affluence they've gained from salmon farming in a way by linking it to this vision of a collective past. And finally, there's a permanent exhibition and museum planned for the wreck that's going to be reconstructed. As you can see in the illustration, this is an architect designed building, and it costs around 10 million crowns, and it will be a centerpiece for the community. Finally, I want to sum up with just going over the main 2 or 3 issues I would like us to be discussing here. The first is, how do the role of wrecks as icons influence how the public perceives these wrecks and engages with them? Just by defining a wreck as an icon also defines a specific group of individual as a specific public related to this iconic wreck. And iconization is also directly linked to how the public, this select group of public, interacts and perceives the past. So public is a very specific term depending on the context. And you see this, Belgica illustrates this very well, because there's little, if any, interest in the wreck locally and really in Norway and as a whole, in contrast to its iconic status as a revered national relic in Belgium. So it just shows this relativeness as far as what constitutes the public. And I think these divergent realities, interests, goals, agendas, and so on are reflected in public organizations, where at the one hand, you have Belgica Society, which is promoting a national vision, an iconic national vision, very much built up around heroic memorialization, as opposed to the Lovind interest group, which is expressing community identity. Finally, how do we balance professional and public interests in underwater cultural heritage research and museology? Accommodating and valuing public input, I think, as an expert, it enables us to escape these restrictive confines we have within academia and also within our role as heritage managers. So for me, involvement in these projects has been really given me a lot more freedom to step outside the boundaries I usually operate within. And looking at the Belgica Society, this group reflects an incredibly broad spectrum of the public, and very many scientists within the natural sciences are involved. And I think that led directly to their participation in this very fruitful collaborative research project we had around the wreck. And Lowland, I think, again, it's a unique collaborative research effort where professional archaeologists who did the actual work, the excavation, the conservation, and so on, were very closely coordinated with the local interest group. And finally, the Lowland project expresses the value of underwater cultural heritage also from a museological perspective that accommodates community input and priorities, and in an atmosphere of respect and constructive dialogue, which I think is extraordinary. It's a unique example for Norway of this kind of project. And I think it's also, finally, I want to say that you really need to focus on the need to disentangle these interwoven roles when you start considering how a wreck will be exhibited. Will it be a shrine? Will it be a memorial? What type of narrative are we generating here? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Stephen. That was very interesting. I think that the questions you raise about ownership and interest groups for particular vessels that are almost certainly going to find a resting place, or their current sites can often be so far from those interest groups themselves is really interesting, and something that we're facing all the time. Okay, we're going to move on to Andy, who is going to talk about the GERT project in Australia.
Thanks, Miranda. Firstly, I'd just like to quickly say thanks to you and IJNA, Mark and Peter and NAST for hosting this, and of course to the Honor Frost Foundation for supporting this outreach at this time. So thanks to all of you. For those of you who don't know, my name's Andy Paducah, and look, I will very briefly introduce you to my citizen science project, which is actually the gathering of information via recreational and technical scientific divers. I just call it GERT. GERT is a part of my PhD research, testing the hypothesis citizen science data collection can productively inform underwater cultural heritage management. In GERT, I'm striving to create a community-driven research agenda where the public have custodianship of underwater cultural heritage, and they're passionate about other objectives, like what's in it for them. As we are aware, the destruction of underwater cultural heritage has increased rapidly in the last couple of 100 years, mainly driven by the direct and indirect impacts by people. However, with climate change and increasingly violent storm events, a site's equilibrium with its physical environment is potentially under greater or new threats from natural events. With a global focus on in situ management, there has never been a time when it's more important to understand what's happening on the seafloor than it is at this stage. Without this information, it is impossible for a site manager to make informed science-based decisions or to potentially preserve our threatened significant heritage into the future. So in Australia and New Zealand, as well as other countries, more real-time site condition data is needed. GERT is a response to this need. Increasingly, in the last few decades, scientists striving to obtain more data have basically embraced a citizen science approach. The No Impact GERT Citizen Science project was designed to bring scientific robustness to a collected monitoring data for underwater sites, and for the first time in maritime archaeology, to bring a potential global scale and longevity to underwater cultural heritage site monitoring programs, which are well beyond the capacity of any single management agency or grant program to resource. The GERT methodology utilizes content developed for the UNESCO Foundation course. It incorporates the Nautical Archaeology Society's phrase adopt a wreck, and it builds on the interest shown by people and the knowledge that they have through their NAS Part 1 training to give them an immediate positive role with underwater cultural heritage. In GERT, members will adopt a wreck that is of interest to them and agree to monitor that site using the GERT documentation methodology at least once a year. So what does that actually look like? In order to collect GERT data, basically you need your standard dive gear, you need access to a 30-meter tape, a camera and underwater housing, some photogrammetry scales or photography scales, and your standard slate and pencils. Once you've collected the data on the templates, you can enter that data through a computer into the GERT website, where you have a survey reporting page, and that data can then be downloaded and attached to any other database or any other system. So the critical thing is the final reports are viewable through the GERT website or through any other statutory database the member chooses to attach that information. In short, it's open access. For me, we're starting to really see that the data included in these sheets, these 5 GERT sheets, aligns with many of the factors that a maritime archaeological conservator or an archaeologist would record when completing an inspection report of a site. The data fields used in GERT are not new. They've been around for ages and they've been used by many other researchers. All these studies have built on early work, even back into the 60s, you know, with people like Anna Frost herself and Dumas and everyone else. In GERT, I've created a guidance document which is available to help members collect the data in a systematic way to understand what the metadata is and then to label and post-process that data. Critically, as I said, GERT is monitoring is non-impact. So there is never a requirement to seek a permit because you're not actually touching or handling anything. The GERT survey method in itself is a scalable program which offers options and priorities for data collection by members dependent on the available bottom time, conditions on site, visibility in the water column, and their archaeological knowledge. As with any citizen science project, the initial parameters utilised in GERT are subject to ongoing addition, removal, modification, subject to the feedback and input from members. Lastly, I just draw your attention to the fact that GERT unashamedly capitalises on improved technology and increased access to this technology, which enables more people to collect robust data. A major facet of this is the ability for individuals to collect images underwater, either those with a scale, such as a condition photo, or via multiple images which can be processed through photogrammetry into 3D scaled models. GERT is not a substitute for conservation scientists undertaking the physical, chemical, electrochemical, and biological factors driving deterioration. That still must go on. It is, however, a democratization of the first 30% of the data that anyone would collect in a survey, collected by more people, more often, in a systematic and robust manner. GERT members' contributions not only facilitate knowledge of their adopted site's condition, but by sharing their data with everyone, can help to have a greater understanding of what is happening in our marine coastal environment from climate change and its impact on our underwater cultural heritage, creating an engaged community of people who are informing a wider and engaged community of people. Thank you.
Thanks, Andy. That was great. It's a good introduction to your project. Now we're going to move on to some questions. I'm going to start with Andy. In your article, you talk about, or you mention some of the problems of the ebb and flow of interest with people building knowledge and skills, but then maybe losing a bit of the impetus and the work fading. And there's been increasingly efforts to build capacity in the avocational public around the world with really quite varying success in this respect. So I want to know what are the factors that make a project continue to engage and make that investment pay off in the long term? What's key to a really good long-term project?
Well, I think people are starting to work out elements that they know are key. So there are, the European Citizen Science Association has put down 10 principles that should be required in any citizen science project, and the Australian Citizen Science Association has effectively adopted those. The difference between citizen science per se and public archaeology is that citizen science is trying to actually make a framework in which people can take the lead in their own research agenda within the broad framework of that project. So it's not just somebody asking you to do something and you collecting it and coming back. It's actually seeking to do that and then to ask those people to then collaborate with other people and then asking them to think about the whole idea themselves and go off and then get other people involved and get all excited and do that as well. So the beauty of citizen science is it's actually trying to, it recognizes the need for all three tiers of behavior, and it's that connection. The other part that you mentioned about the ebb and flow of volunteers, the bit that I always find most important is there must be an opportunity to go from you start something because you're very much interested in it, but you stay in it because you make friends and you do things together with people with similar interests and you build that familial association. That is so important to build and foster that relationship. And as such, Gert actually always talks about developing a dive team, which is also a quasi-research team that you work with. So you're building on each other's skills and knowledge. So you're supporting each other to not only achieve the fieldwork, but to analyze and write up the data.
Yeah. Peter, I wonder if you wanted to come in on that, if you want to bring the Nautical Archaeology Society perspective.
Yeah, I really agree with what Andy said about particularly the social aspect. And that's really what is quite important with the Nautical Archaeology Society. We often ask our members for lots of feedback to make sure we're doing the right thing. And they're always very obliging to do that. And lots of the feedback is we're part of it's not just a membership, it's part of a family. And I have lots of anecdotal evidence of people who have, become friends just as a result of coming on a couple of NAS courses. So I do think that while people are signing up or for Gert or for NAS for learning new things, they're kind of sticking around for the new opportunities and relationships that they can become part of. And of course, if that helps us protect our maritime heritage, then we're not going to complain, are we?
No. Gusten, I think you wanted to come in, and I wanted to ask you particularly if you think having the virtual museum so that the information gathered by the divers in your project was quickly available and there was an immediate output that the general, well, even more people could see was important in keeping it going.
Yes, actually, it was kind of a series of projects. That's why I wanted to comment on Andy's work. Quite surprised because, like, what I published in IJNA in 2011, part of my PhD was on data collection, relying on the public, like the divers, the recreational divers, comments, sketches, measurements, etc., etc. So I'm quite surprised that we are in the same page. So very appreciated. Yours look quite good. About returning back to Miranda's question, is that in our case, we had to train the divers first to have these systematic data collection methodologies. Then we happen to be using these methods. But our case, as our concern was virtual museum, we were trying to get this more organized and, in other terms, this parametric data from the artifacts in the systematic survey, so that we can make this 3D visualization of these objects. So I'm talking about 2007, actually, where the photogrammetric tools and even underwater photography was not that mainstream. Was of course around, but not as easy as GoPros. I remember GoPros was not around anyway. So we spent a lot of time on the methodology first, how to collect the real measurements. And when the photogrammetry, underwater photogrammetry came in, more available, because we were trying to do more low budget, as well, we happen to be used in this virtual museum at the very basic level for immersive 360-degree, immersions, like parametric, like panoramic, etc., etc.
Yeah. And Stephen, I wanted to ask you, particularly with the Lowvent medieval boat project, I think it's quite extraordinary in that it was almost instantly owned by your local community. It sounds like that you didn't have to do much work to sell them the story. It was already there. What things do you think have worked to make the community adopt the wreck in the way that they have and see it so completely as part of their history and owned by that community?
They were the ones that initiated everything. The whole process was initiated by the local community. Actually, within a month after the wreck was found, they were already very eager to have it surveyed and excavated. So since 1976, they've been contacting us at the museum regularly to sort of push for this. And I think it wasn't until like around 2015 that they actually succeeded in organizing themselves in a way that was, initially it was a lot of commercial actors that were doing the requests, and it became more and more of a community effort, reflecting a broad range of individuals within the community. There's only 500 people there, so, but and that really, it was something I felt that we really had to respond to this. And I got in touch with the National Maritime Museum, and we discussed it, and we said this really should be done as a joint research project. And throughout the process, this group was very receptive and open to all of our suggestions. They had no issues with us controlling how things were done, and the whole series of phases in excavation, how long it took, our own budgets, etc. They gave us carte blanche, but yet they were continually interested in the results and what we were hoping to get out of the research. And they already had their sights on the exhibition. So now we're at the phase where we're done with PEG. So it's going through freeze drying in situ, which is the first time that's being done in Norway. It's actually within a huge freezer area because they have the fisheries resources there. So it's being freeze dried in situ. After PEG, it's being constructed now after the PEG treatment, and it will be freeze dried. And that's the first time that's been attempted. Usually you take the individual components and freeze dry them and then put it together. But this enables the entire wreck to be freeze dried. And then it will be moved to this museum that they are already starting to build. And and all of the conditions for the museum were dictated by us, by our conservators. So.
And were local people involved in the excavation at all? Or
yeah, they were on site all the time. All the school kids were there constantly. We had like live feed, webcams, and so people could see the excavation in real time during that. And the advantage was that we drained the site. So we were able to excavate it and give access to everyone in the community during the excavation. So there was, I mean, it's a small community, but I would say everyone in the community was certainly there a number of times watching us do the work. So it really generated a lot of mutual respect and I think communication, really. And their motives, I think, are purely, they see this as a national or a natural part of their community and heritage. And they saw that the threats of it disintegrating were very real. And we saw that too. Our hands are tied because of budgetary restrictions. This is a completely unique project. It's never been attempted before, to my knowledge, where someone goes in, a local group, and completely finances all the phases of excavation through to exhibition. And that will actually be the only medieval shipwreck to be exhibited in Norway when it's exhibited. So it's unique.
It's certainly an extraordinary.
Yeah,
it's an extraordinary project.
It's one of a kind. I think that's a real success story. And that's because the impetus is purely local.
Yeah. So I wanted to ask, we've had a question in, how much is the success of these projects, these different projects, down to one or two individuals building the movement within their community? So I think in Andy's article, he talks about super volunteers or movers and shakers who in the community who can be used to that effect. Perhaps we'll go back to Andy first with that.
Look, it's definitely the case that volunteers volunteer. So that's the first thing. You tend to find that people who have got a history of volunteering get engaged. You've got people who are always willing to share what they know and who are willing to be involved, who will lead from the front, and their enthusiasm will bring other people along. So it is a truism that you will have one or two individuals who stand out in any sort of program. Whether you're in your workplace or in a volunteering situation, there will always be one or two individuals who'll go that extra mile and contribute more and share more. I do think one of the things I love in citizen science is the idea that people move from in through different phases, and those phases recognise their role as expanding to working with others more effectively. So the concept of citizen science is showing their growth is actually their capacity to engage and be linked in with more people. So a few people will start something always.
Peter, do you have anything to add?
Yes, I definitely do. The Nautical Archaeology Society could not function without our super volunteers. It's not a term I've been familiar with before, so I'm going to embrace that. Thank you, Andy. So NAS certainly has a lot of super volunteers, and often I've got two examples of where we've started off projects that then have just kind of been taken over by our volunteers, and we're very happy for them to run with it. So one of them has been running for 10 years now. It's the Big Anchor project, and it was set up with funding, and we kind of set up an online database for people to be able to record their anchors. While it was set up and funded, that was great. We had paid staff to work on it initially, but now it's run by one of our volunteers who just happens to be obsessed with anchors and is very happy to keep running with the database and encouraging people to complete entries on it and add to our corporate knowledge of our collective knowledge of anchors. And that's been going for 10 years now. A more recent example of this has been amazingly encouraging. We started an online research project to keep some of our volunteers busy during the lockdown, and it was just supposed to be, there's two wrecks on a beach in Wales, let's see what archives we can find online about them. I set up a messenger groups for everyone to keep in touch with each other because the researchers are scattered all across the UK, and my phone never stops pinging because as volunteers they're uncovering all sorts of little mysteries, and it's just amazing what they've uncovered, and they're really enjoying it, and it's a way for them to stay in touch when they can't actually physically meet to go to the archives and do things. So without the enthusiasm of a few of those people, it just, this research wouldn't get done, and we wouldn't be discovering new things about our maritime heritage.
Gusden, did you find when you were working with training local people that you had one or two star volunteers who helped get the message across? I know you worked with a lot of dive shops and dive schools as well, and have assessed the degree to which the information was that you gave was taken on board.
Yeah, actually we did run across a lot of super volunteers. I was one of the super volunteer as well at the beginning, before I kind of changed my path from architecture to nautical archaeology. So in a way, I'm like one of these examples. But also, especially in Turkey, not about the shipwrecks only, but also in the land archaeology, we know that a lot of super volunteers, sometimes sponge divers, are the ones who are discovering these wrecks and informing the authorities and the archaeologists, including Uluburun shipwreck, Gelidonia shipwreck. These are discovered and told to these, to the educated bodies, to the specialists, and it was their own effort. So in a way, in a different, cultural perspective, Turkey, where everything is about sharing, adding each other, from a good and bad perspective. We can discuss these things, of course, but, knowing something and helping the others for a scientific reason is quite a, a good motivation. But of course, no need to say that we have these, bad volunteers, not volunteers actually, who are more into, finding the money value of these artifacts. But I want to focus on the good side of it.
Stephen, what was the experience in Norway?
I think for Loven, there were some sort of individuals that were definitely spearheading the interests within the local community, and quite long-lived. Some of them went all the way back to 1976 and continued their interest. But I think on the other hand, there were some individuals, but that generated more of a synergy within the community. And I think the final group they ended up with, it wasn't just a little clique of individuals, but I think it was truly representative of the community. And on an island that's isolated with only 500 people, you have a very local kind of focus. And I think that's been reflected. They've had some issues with the museum network because they're not a part of the county museum network, and that's intentional on their part. And they received a lot of negative press from the accepted authorities. And I think this is very interesting because, in a sense, they're really deciding themselves how they want to view their own heritage. And I don't see that as necessarily negative, that they're seeing themselves set apart from the accepted infrastructure of museology organizations. And that's kind of new for us because we're within that network as well. And I think it's quite interesting as an experiment that a local community, I mean, they become a component of that system. It's almost inevitable. But despite that, I think and I'm excited about the exhibition because I think how we exhibit the material from the wreck will be very much directed by the local community, what things they see as important, what aspects of the story revolving around the wreck are things they wish to prioritize rather than we as academics. To me, that's like a breath of fresh air. So
this is a question that I'm interested in, is how we balance or incorporate our own research aims with the research interests of the public that we're asking to work with us or we're working with. So Andy, your project so far has been mainly to do with recording and management. Have you seen signs that the groups that have come together do start their own research program? Do they start asking the questions or setting up a series of questions that they want to investigate on these sites? No,
this hasn't yet happened. This is really the ideal where you're moving towards, and this is a stage that's very advanced for almost anyone. At the moment, I'm seeing the first two stages rather than the third stage really appearing. However, there are examples of it, particularly from a marine science perspective, where people are interested in the environmental components of the monitoring, and they can look at all the different sites and all the environmental monitoring and then start to actually draw information out of that from various lenses of marine science. So they could be looking at the algae, they could be looking at hard corals, they could be looking at pelagic fish or other things like this around things. You know, I always like to look at nudibranchs, so that's totally different. But anyone who wants to impose a lens of research into the data that's collected, they can. It just has to get to a sufficient body in which that makes it worthwhile. There is a component within GERT where I talk about the concept of the science champion, and that's an individual who has inherently within their life already a large technical knowledge of a particular area, whatever discipline it's in, and they can assist other members by answering questions, but also looking at the data and interpreting the data for people. So that's a real contributory and collaborative role lives within this sort of team-focused citizen science project.
Peter, do you want to come in on
Yeah.
that?
Yes, definitely. We have a current ongoing fieldwork project at Sandwich, which is in Kent on the southeast coast of the UK. And it was started off as a really nice 5-mile beach with 10 shipwrecks on it, really easy logistics for me to run training courses, and it's perfect. I had no preconception about anything except teaching people how to use tape measures and to not get drowned by the incoming tide. And we got lots and lots of people recurring, because sunrise there is gorgeous, and that's always when low tide occurs, when we're working out there. And we've got all of these different people who have now come, they keep coming back every time we go, and they've just got their own little research ideas that they want to follow up. And I don't have to do anything. I just kind of organize, we're going these dates is when the good tide is, and they all come along and off they go in their little safe groups, so that they're keeping safe on the beach. And we come back with all this amazing data, and we're really learning a lot of information about these 10 shipwrecks.
Great. I've got a question in which I think will interest everybody. It's, how do national and international legislation help or hinder community engagement? Where should we start? Andy, maybe.
Look, I'm happy to start on this one, but I'll just finish off. I think it's important to say that the idea of the adopter rec, where an individual adopts a site that's of interest to them, that is the start of the previous question. That the individual is already choosing a site that they're interested in researching. So I think you've already got that, but then there's all these little other questions that will bolt on over time, and they're the bits that we're looking for, not the primary question. In regards to Legislation Australia, well, I was fortunate to write the current act with my colleague Grant Luckman, so I'm pretty much across what it says at times. We were very fortunate where we could amend the legislation in such a way that we put into the objectives of the Act the role of the public. Now, in Australia, we've been managing the public's participation in heritage through a thing we call the Historic Shipwrecks Program, and we had that as sort of an objective within that program. However, we've now taken that out of as a principle, and we've now embedded it within legislation, and we've elevated the public. So we've given the public clarity around the requirement for people who are working in the legislation to promote underwater culture and heritage, to raise the public's awareness, to get their appreciation, and to give them opportunity effectively, to give them opportunity to access sites appropriately. So we've given clarity around the fact that the Act's intent is to encourage the public's participation in an appropriate manner. And I think that's a very nice place to be, and a great legacy of the new Act with that unique element.
Kristen, I think you wanted to come in.
Yeah,
on that, or was it on the previous
perspective? So in one sentence, we can say the legislations in Turkey is quite a legal labyrinth, quite chaotic, because each time we have to do an underwater research, we had to, I remember, 7 permissions from different bodies like Coast Guard, Minister of Culture and Tourism. And everything is becoming more central in Turkey. The Minister of Culture and Tourism is the main body. And if you want to do a research, you have to apply it almost like a year before, almost. That's why even not only for the research activities, but for the training activities, we decided to have Archaeopark because of these constraints. As we didn't want to wait, for NAS trainings or SAT trainings to happen for a year for a research, we decided to create a replica site, a reconstruction site that is not a heritage site at all, so that we can train, our divers, we can test our methods, and also we can, go and have dives there. So in a way, the very central authority happened to create new solutions to our training system. So it was good. We happened to build Archaeopark. But also we are still in need of something, because in the Turkish waters, that is quite clear, and there are different activities that you can do. usually the volunteers, they're the interested ones. Returning back to the previous question, is that the divers who already have some experience and who are already bored of recreational divers. So we have quite an intensive amount of divers in Turkey, because they don't want to run after a fish only, you know, they want to have something, do something useful, more scientific. So in a way, you know, in my waters, things a bit, you know, more complicated than I guess when compared to Andy's case.
Stephen, did you have anything to add on that point?
Yeah, I think I'd like to speak more to general legislation because we have a quite good Cultural Heritage Management Act that involves both shipwrecks and their cargo, and there's a 100-year boundary there. But I think what's happening now is there's more and more restrictions on us as scientific divers. And I think Norway now, with the new rules they have, they're probably the strictest in the world in terms of defining who can do scientific diving. And essentially, we're being all placed within the category of like Class 1 commercial divers. And that's something that is really way more stringent than the European diving certification as it stands today. So we're really excluding ourselves and restricting ourselves and cutting ourselves off more and more from the public, and certainly the diving public. And I think another factor involved in that distancing is the fact that less and less recreational divers belong to clubs. They're acting as individuals, and it's very hard to have an interface with an individual recreational diver. You need to have some kind of group to deal with. So that's created a lot of additional issues. And then with the new rules regarding certification, we're not even allowed to participate in scuba diving with amateurs, with recreational divers, because we're on the job. So it's creating this boundary because we have much more stringent requirements. We have to have surface supply below 18 meters. I mean, all of these measures, we have to have a minimum of 4 individuals to dive at all. So we can't participate with these recreational divers any longer as sort of guiding them through a wreck or interacting with them in that sort of way. So that's incredibly unfortunate, and it's become
I
a
think
real
these are
issue.
problems that have cropped up in several countries. I know we had new legislation in France a couple of years ago that has had fairly similar effects. And Andy, I know in Australia, the whole scientific diving question has been quite difficult.
A very long ongoing debate, trying to change codes, trying to get standards adjusted to enable people. As Stephen was saying, if on one hand you're protecting people through better workplace health and safety, on the other you're having an impact where you're driving the opportunity for the public to participate in some things out the door. Australia started because large numbers of the community worked with few archaeologists, and they were able to do an enormous amount of work on sites. With professionalisation, we've moved to lots of archaeologists, no public, and very little buy-in from the public because of that. So there is a huge issue in this space for the public to retain a real legitimate role in doing public archaeology.
I've got one more question that I'd like you all to try and answer. There appears to be genuine cooperative interaction within the international nautical archaeology academic community. What further steps can be taken to achieve and increase similar levels of public cooperation and interaction internationally? And most importantly, who should take the lead and set the agenda for this? So I think that's a really interesting question, because we do, you know, the international academic community is quite close-knit. We're always talking to each other. How do we get the public talking to each other across their borders about their nautical research?
I'm happy to answer that one for a start, as a bit of discussion
Go
point.
on then, Peter, then give us an idea.
Well, in the past, NAS has run various international projects, and we do have, I can't remember exactly how many. I think we've got 29 international training partners at the moment in 23 countries. So we've definitely got, we're an international organisation. Getting those international people to talk to each other is sometimes a little bit harder, but I can tell you that we have lots of people coming from other countries to do the courses in the UK. And I know of lots of our UK members who decide to take a bit of a holiday and go and do their NAS training in warmer climates, which I understand entirely. But I think that's kind of on a more local level. I think there's a very big movement that is taking place through UNESCO, the Decade of Ocean Science, which I think is going to be a great driver in being able to cross boundaries, cross borders for the development of citizen science. While there doesn't seem to be a great deal of funding available just yet, it's the decade hasn't been launched yet. That gets launched next year. I'm hoping that there will definitely be programs that will encourage international citizen science projects, and we'll certainly be doing our best to develop as many as we can, and working with other people to try and use the UNESCO kind of banner and planning to encourage more international cooperation. And I think that's a good way to think about it in the not too distant future.
Absolutely.
Andy, did you want to come in?
Yeah, look, I'll just say too, of course, in the Decade of Ocean Science, 2021, 2030, mapping the ocean, understanding what's happening in the marine environment, understanding what's happening through climate change, these are all absolutely key things. Climate change is going to impact our coastal heritage. Having a systematic, robust monitoring method that individuals can apply, that way they can document change in their site over time, that is going to be our way to have a benchmark of what's happening to our coastal heritage. GERT was built specifically for this purpose, but also designed so that anyone in any country can actually apply the same standards. They choose a site, but they can compare what's going on their site with other proximal sites or sites further afield in different environmental conditions to understand change being driven through natural phenomena or cultural phenomena. So yes, it's already there, but GERT's only very nascent. It's only operating in 2 countries at the moment. The potential for it to go bigger, but early days, early steps. So once these standards are picked up, or if they are picked up, or other citizen science projects which exist out there, and let's face it, there's hundreds of citizen science projects that exist in space. The advantage is, as long as the data that people are collecting is meaningful and they're using that data to actually understand what's going on, then we will get a really good outcome, and people from any country around the world can communicate to each other on the same data fields, and that will enable that conversation to start, and they can assist each other doing the monitoring because they all know what the same method is, so they can collaborate in any country together on a given site.
Guzden, I think you wanted to come in.
I just wanted to have like a further comment and question. At the data collection level, using the public is definitely, you know, a requirement, but I think we should think about the experience of the users. I mean, I'm referring to this Andre Malraux's Museum Without Borders or Museum Without Walls. Okay, once we have these artifacts, yes, in the museums, but even in like during this pandemic, it's even more important to be able to reach this data and experience this data, or create some kind of a virtual museum so that we can experience, you know, that's one thing. And another thing is, you know, some of the projects now as artificial intelligence, you know, and artificial intelligence for culture, heritage projects are around. Now, I happen to see more technological involvement to these projects, like Intel is scanning like Great Wall of China. Microsoft is doing some projects about like Mont Saint-Michel, you know, and more like Earth Archive projects in US, where they are scanning like with LiDAR, with like bathymetric data, the land data, everything. So in a way, we are in need of creating a digital heritage I would say, for the next generation, only for document, of course, but also for people to, to experience this. I would love to have and visit a virtual museum of the Nautical Archaeology Society Big Anchor project. I know there are, that like the inventory is there, but why not in a more interactive ways?
Good idea.
I certainly think it's one of the strengths of your project, is the virtual museum, which immediately gives a almost tangible result from the work done by the divers. And I know Andy's building that into his project too, so that the data that is collected is open to everybody. They can say, look, my data's here, everyone can see it. And I think those are important things in keeping these projects going and making them just more generally useful to the community. I think we are going to have to wind up because we've already gone over an hour. It's been very interesting talking to all of you. Thank you so much. Thank you, Peter Knott, Education Officer with the Nautical Archaeology Society, Guzden Barinlioglu, Stephen Wickler and Andy Paducah. Let's thank Mark and the staff who aren't in the NAS office at the moment. They're spread out all over the place. And to the Honor Frost Foundation for sponsoring these webinars.